Hello everyone and welcome to Saturn Returns with me, Caggie Dunlop. This is a new podcast that aims to bring clarity during transitional times where there can be confusion and doubt.
I decided actually I want to pull it all back and just focus on the discomfort for me of what it would be to sit in the discomfort of celibacy and not get that validation from anyone. And I actually think, at least for me in my life right now, it's more powerful and empowered for me to acknowledge my vagina as being precious.
That is the brilliant Shona Vertue, who is my guest this week. Shona is an author, speaker, yoga teacher, personal trainer, and creator of the online mobility program, The Vertue Method. Shona is also a personal friend of mine, and I love her energy and how open she is. In this episode, we go in on sex and relationships, and we are not holding back on this one. It's not every day that you hear women talking about sex in this way, so brace yourself, you are in for a treat. But before we get to her, I just want to check in with our astrology expert, Flo Devereux, who's helping us understand what's really happening during our Saturn return. In episodes 1 and 2, Flo explained how Saturn return comes about and why Saturn in particular has this connection with authenticity and responsibility. So this time, I wanted to know a little bit more about how we can become more authentic and responsible and the role that Saturn plays, and why those lessons can often be so painful.
It's quite a long transition of kind of birthing yourself as an adult, letting go of what is no longer serving you, kind of taking responsibility for yourself. That's the main thing with Saturn return is
responsibility.
Yeah.
And I think if you start listening to the sort of pings and the things that are happening, you can start working with it. Rather than it's the resistance, I think, that causes the conflict.
And the main thing is Saturn is a lot about accountability. So it's like personal accountability. So if things aren't going well in your life, look at what you're doing. And because it's all about, like, if we think about what responsibility is, it's like your ability to respond. And Saturn wants you to become a master, like badass, flexible, high level, wise person at how you respond to life.
I had the biggest test of that in the last couple of months because I've been learning about this stuff and thinking that I'm incorporating it into my life, and then suddenly something will happen that makes you revert back to former behaviour out of habit. And then there was this moment when I was like, I can't choose what's happening to me, but I can choose how I respond to it.
That's exactly right. Yeah,
and when you have those moments, you're like, that is even if it's something awful, there's something empowering about that, because you're like, I see what's happening and I'm going to choose a different way. I can choose how I respond to this.
Exactly. That's the key lesson to learn over Saturn return. But I think Saturn does teach through struggle. So in a way, it's also learning how to embrace struggle, because there's a friction. Yeah, there's a friction, because I think also a nice way to think about it is Saturn is the last planet that we can see with the naked eye, and everything before Saturn is, if we think about the structure of the psyche, and we have all of the conscious stuff going on, but then there's all of this vast unconscious, the personal unconscious, and then also the collective unconscious. Saturn rules the boundary between the two. And I think what Saturn teaches us is that for true self-mastery, we need to be able to kind of have quite a flexible boundary between the two and be able to navigate our own personal unconsciouses so that we are actually aware of the choices that we're making. And so we often gain insight into our unconscious through struggle. And so Saturn sits there on the boundary between conscious and unconscious and says, how mature are you going to be at stepping across this boundary in a flexible and
what about
grown-up way?
Acknowledging what might be a part of you that's operating from a subconscious level, basically, and having the ability to look into that and take ownership over it, rather than just being reactive.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is always really tough. I think also my nature was always to run away. And someone said to me recently, they were described, I'm going to be transparent, it was a therapist, and she was saying that you know your coping mechanism of things has always been to to like move country or run or like reinvent yourself or change yourself. And I was listening to her and I was like, part of me thought, yes, and it's genius. And what
worked really well, thank you.
Yeah. But I also was like, what other way is there? And she said, you just have to sit with the pain. And ever since I was like, it's brutal that, but there's so much in that. And that is where the growth comes. That is like, you know, these painful experiences are here to teach us. And I think if we can work a bit more with that rather than, again, like resisting it, these things, because it's going to come. It's going to come anyway.
Life serves you up challenges. And if you can kind of make really good friends with the Saturn in your chart, your Saturn, and you can do that a lot through your Saturn return, then you have this inner authority and strength within yourself to know that you can handle it.
If you have any questions at all about this, please do get in touch. You can find Flo at Astrology for the Curious on Instagram, or you can reach out to me at Caggie's World. Now, back to our guest today, Shona Vertue. Shona and I first met, I think it was about 7 years ago in Australia, and we were introduced through a mutual friend, Maddie Shaw. And we hung out a bit, and then I didn't see her for a really long time. But when I was in Australia this Christmas that's just passed, I saw that she was there, and so I reached out, and we ended up having dinner together, and we just ended up having the best time and talking about so many interesting things, and we're just on the same wavelength about a lot. So it just became incredibly obvious to me that I had to get her on the podcast. And as you will discover, we discuss sex and relationships in a very open and honest and considered way. I hope it doesn't come across as vulgar to anyone, because you don't usually hear women talking about stuff like this that openly. It's still considered quite taboo. I absolutely love this episode, and I think that you're going to take away a lot from it. So have an open mind, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks so much for listening. Hello and welcome, Shona.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming by.
Yeah.
You literally just walked in and we went fully in.
We dove straight in.
So we figured we should get this rolling. What we were just talking about a few seconds ago in the kitchen, I want to get in on.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's just bring it to the table.
So it feels like today's topic is going to be sex and relationships.
Mm-hmm. Let's unpack it.
Let's unpack
We both
it.
are well versed in failed ones. I don't know. I certainly am. I'm well versed in good ones too.
But is a relationship ever a failure?
Well, it's hard, isn't it? Because it's like, according to Disney, absolutely.
Oh God, Disney has a lot to answer for.
Yeah, Disney has basically fucked up a generation, because every single Disney cartoon back then, when we were growing up, definitely was about rescuing the woman. According to my interpretation of Disney growing up, it was very much like meet the person and then live happily ever after. Mm-hmm. So if that was the standard, then yes, I feel like there is failure in relationship. However, I think even the ones that have technically failed according to the Disney test, actually the things that I've learned and developed, and we talked about this in Sydney, was like, whoa, like it's a mirror.
Yeah, and it's an opportunity to up level. And when you stop seeing things in that way, everything changes. Because even when a relationship falls apart, you can be like, oh, okay, this is bringing up this. This is what this has shown me that I needed to see. And then up level from that experience.
Absolutely. Were we talking about healthy interdependency?
Yeah, because again, the sort of Disney thing is this very like dependent, and I'm 100% guilty if in a lot of my relationships have been modeled on this, like someone comes and saves me, I follow their path and abandon my own.
Yes.
And in that, I rely on them too heavily in many, many ways. And then so when the relationship ends, it's obviously you're upset about the relationship ending, but then there's a sort of like the abandonment of self that you have to acknowledge that may have happened months before, but you didn't feel it because you were just attaching yourself onto another person. And I think both you and I oscillate between being really dependent on someone or so independent. So like when a relationship falls apart and then you go back to, you know, the self-care and the work and all this stuff, and you feel really good in your independence, but then you kind of build up this armor around it.
Oh, massive armor.
And because women are also celebrated for like being independent, but where is the line and where does that become unhealthy too.
Yeah, and it definitely became unhealthy for me, and I took it straight into my next relationships. So it was like
The independence.
the independence, and then what I came to realize was really an avoidance of intimacy, because intimacy takes vulnerability, and vulnerability is scary as fuck. So it's like, and that's a huge thing for me. I feel if I have needs, if I am vulnerable, if I express my needs, that I will be abandoned.
Does that stem from childhood?
100%.
Yeah.
100%. I seek so hard to avoid abandonment that
It keeps coming up.
it comes back. It comes up because it's the fear that I have of it. And truly, I'm the only one that abandons myself. No one in the past, not even in my relationships, have they abandoned me. I have actually abandoned myself by, and we talk about this, choosing to disconnect from our own needs and just give ourselves like a martyr to this person or this relationship or whatever it is, in a desperate act to abandon myself.
So the abandonment actually is coming from you.
It's 100% coming from me.
Do you think that's because it's going to keep coming up until you actually learn to go about it a different way, which is basically to honour your needs at the beginning? Because that's what we said, like relationships will bring up all the stuff that you don't want to face. Also what you said about intimacy, because I think intimacy commonly is thrown around as like a thing about sex often.
Absolutely.
Like you can have like intimate sex and then people think that's intimacy. That is not what intimacy is. Like that's intimate sex, very different thing. But intimacy in a relationship is being completely vulnerable. And that's something that we've been conditioned our entire lives to avoid at all costs.
Yeah.
So people can be in these relationships and never actually
experience intimacy. Absolutely.
Which is kind of scary.
You know, which very commonly can occur, particularly in a society that may not necessarily encourage us to unpack this stuff.
Oh no, we're encouraged to numb it by whatever means we can find.
Totally, whether it's alcohol or some form of substance, whether it's social media, whether it's sex itself. It's like there's so much that we can utilize to sort of avoid this stuff. And that's the thing, is we don't take enough time to question that stuff because society has really placed a taboo and a stigma on checking in with that stuff. You know, like we were just such a culture of numbing ourselves. So whether it's like, you know, if you've got back pain, take a Panadol. You know, we're so used to being in that mindset. Numb the symptoms so that you can keep working, or numb the symptoms so that you can get on and you don't have to pay attention. But there's a reason the pain is there. And it's the same thing for, you know, when we feel sad thoughts or uncomfortable thoughts, they're there for a reason. They're trying to highlight their guidance, right? And if we continue to numb and don't check in, it's like turning off the GPS when you are lost.
That is
like,
that's such a good explanation of what it is. What I had happen for me at the end of last year was suddenly, for the first time in my life, I was getting the worst period pains before my period, like agonizing. First time ever. And I was like, what? Where is this coming from? And then some stuff happened, like not some so great stuff in my life in terms of relationship.
Yeah.
And then I was speaking with a friend that runs a retreat and is very, very spiritual. And I've been telling her that this stuff around my period was coming up. And she said, I bet it stops now that like everything's come out.
Everything's come out and you're, exactly.
And I was like, no, that's crazy. And it stopped. And now insane. I don't get anything. Because to go back to, again, what we mentioned in the kitchen.
Yeah,
you are,
let's bring it back.
At the moment,
single. Celibate.
Well,
single and celibate.
Single
and celibate. I didn't know which one you were going to use.
Well, we're going straight in.
We're going straight in.
Can I talk about that?
Yeah, you can. Totally. I actually have been wanting to talk about this, and I've been trying to think of I'm sort of just experiencing it at the moment. So I've made this choice to be celibate. So no masturbation, no sex.
That's a big decision to make.
It is, but also it's sort of been gradual. So masturbation is a really interesting one, particularly for me. I have a really interesting relationship with masturbation. I discovered masturbation at a very young age, and I utilized it a lot during a tumultuous childhood. And
as an escape.
And as a stress relief. And that's common. When you speak to psychologists, they often talk about the fact that children will use it as a means to relieve stress.
And adults.
And adults definitely do, but it's something that we learn in childhood and we shouldn't feel ashamed of it. And shame is a really dangerous thing around things like sex, because then it festers and leads to crazy ass shit.
Oh my God, I know.
Right. So shame, sex, not a good idea. Just drop the shame, or find ways to unpack it at least. Anyway, so I wanted to try to find a way to sort of stop the masturbation. But then, because actually when I left the last guy that I was seeing, and that was quite a heavy departure, it hit me quite hard. And to be honest, he was really a rebound for another relationship that had hit me really hard. And so I've just had like a succession of painful heartbreak kind of scenarios. And just before the last one was ending, I found myself getting incredibly horny to the point where I just was like seeking sexual gratification in so many places. Like from him, but also because it was ending, and we weren't ever together, but we were just seeing each other, and we hadn't ever put kind of like, we're boyfriend and girlfriend, but we had a very intense emotional connection. And I really started to convince myself that, you know, this was love and this was the man I was meant to be with for the rest of my life. And it was really intense. But as I started to feel myself slipping away, I was suddenly seeking validation sexually from so many other people. And it was like this physical feeling of like, I just want to masturbate all the time. I just want to find like, I'd have people, you know, guys in the DMs or like whatever it was like just constantly needing
that validation.
The validation. And because there's addiction in my family, as soon as anything feels like it's beginning to become an addiction,
You check yourself.
I check myself before I wreck myself, because I know where that goes. And so it was purely becoming an addiction, that validation.
How long was that period of time?
I would say it was like probably a few months. And I think it got to the point where I realized it was actually at this moment where I looked at my phone and I had like probably like 4 or 5 messages from different guys that I was sort of entertaining a sexual flirtatious connection with. And I wasn't having sex with them. I just was like, it was just that kind of validation, as we said. And I looked at my phone and I just thought, this doesn't feel like progression.
It's not coming from a good place.
This is not coming from a good place, and this is not where I want to take my life. Maybe when I was in my early 20s and I was exploring, you know, myself sexually, but it's like, I'm 33, I know what I want. And I decided, actually, I want to pull it all back and just focus on the discomfort for me of what it would be to sit in the discomfort of celibacy and not get that validation from anyone.
That is huge.
And I actually think it's more, at least for me in my life right now, it's more powerful and empowered for me to acknowledge my vagina as being precious. But I think before it was kind of, I didn't really acknowledge the power of getting to know someone first and then choosing whether I want to allow their energy inside me.
And also...
and their dick.
But also of them really choosing you. Because people can say all the right things and like message you compliments or whatever and say they miss you or all this stuff, but them actually choosing you in their behavior is a very different thing. And you know the difference. Yes. We all know the difference of how that feels. And I think women, and we're guilty of doing this collectively, is like when a guy is treating a girlfriend badly and she's upset and she's analysing it, and girls sort of will like pat her on the back and be like, oh no, but he's just scared. And I was like, no. He's not choosing you.
He's giving you fucking breadcrumbs. And you deserve the full seeded loaf. This is what my girlfriend says this to me. So thankfully now I've surrounded myself with girlfriends that will call me on that bullshit.
And you know what, that ties in perfectly to this idea that I've always had. It's like we're on our own paths. All of us are.
Yeah.
And then someone comes along and you just abandon yourself to go off on their path because like they're going on theirs. Like they don't give a fuck. And then you're like, well, I'm going to lose them if I don't abandon mine. So it's like that thing of breadcrumbs. You're like, wait, come back.
So true. So true.
And before you know it, you are lost in that wilderness.
You're lost in that wilderness. You have to find your way back.
And so much of the pain around, like, and I mentioned this earlier, is like the having to go back and find your way. I think a huge part of that is the abandonment of self because
yes. Oh my God, I just realized this the other day. Yes.
And then you sacrificed your own needs to be with this person. And we often hold resentment to that person because of that, but actually to take ownership over that and be like, I let me down.
Dude, this is mega. Like, I'm 33 and I'm only just realizing this. I wish I knew this when I was in my early 20s or even my teens.
Oh, God, yeah.
But I think you have to learn that lesson real time and feel the pain and sit in that, because I just think it's so fucking true. Like, honestly, the pain of these last 2 relationships have been because I willingly chose to abandon self to become who I thought they wanted me to become or to meet their needs. And the pain of realizing that I had abandoned myself brought me straight back to childhood and the fear of abandonment, because it's like,
that's the original wound.
That's the original wound, is that you're not lovable. So if you are reinforcing that point to yourself, essentially your external universe or external manifestations in relationships are trying to reflect that back to you so you can see where you're doing it. You're doing the damage. We have to take ownership of that, definitely. And that's not me saying you're doing the damage to the relationship. You're doing the damage to yourself. Yeah, because, yeah.
And that's also a really complicated thing to reprogram. Like, I mean, anything's really complicated to reprogram and takes a lot of work because you're having to rewire yourself. So I guess your way of doing that is through the celibacy.
Through celibacy. Because it's the most uncomfortable thing for me to do. It's to suddenly go, do you know what? None of this.
And also our sexual drive is such a powerful one like probably the most powerful in terms of the abandonment of self.
I'm trying to also reprogram what I find attractive, because I think that for a long time, I know it's really hard.
Okay, I've got a really interesting theory on this, because I went and did this thing a few years ago when I was in like it was like the beginning of my Saturn returns-ish, but I didn't really know that was happening. I was just like, oh my God, I'm miserable, I'm lost, what am I doing, who am I?
Yeah.
And this girlfriend of mine she was like, I really feel like you should come on this retreat that I run. And anyway, I ended up going, and it was, at the beginning, I was like, I
hate this.
No. I am booking my flight out of here. And she called me out on it, and she was like, give it a day. And it really put me on this path, like in a massive way. And one of the things that we did there was that we had 2 days of silence, and we had to journal around relationships in our lives, like whether it's friendships, parents, whatever. You had a timeline and you wrote about people that came up. It could be even something that seemed insignificant, but if that came into your mind, like write it down.
Wow.
And then you would write about the like really key ones and like journal around. And I was like, what are we doing here? They were like, just do it. And anyway, after doing this for 2 days, I started looking at it. I was like, oh my God. And there was this theme with all my relationships that I would go for addicts.
Fuck.
And I mean, with that, like, I don't want to share too much, but like, that's from a parent thing. So much of what we seek in a relationship is, and you either go, it's called like a recoil thing, where you will go for like the opposite. So if you've got a father that's like never ever present, always working, you might go for someone that's like really unambitious and always there. So that's one way it can go. Or you will find someone that possesses a lot of the similarities, often bad.
Yeah.
Because that is what your concept of love is growing up, and that's what you've observed.
Yes.
So you go out and you seek it in the world. So to have that awareness is really powerful.
Yeah.
So it's about knowing what those things are that draw you to that person, but being aware so it doesn't become like a damaging trait, which is really hard.
Which is really hard if you're attracted to addicts.
Yeah. Well, it's I've always been I've gravitated towards extremes, whether they're good or bad.
Yeah.
And having someone that has that sort of flightiness that makes me feel a bit unsafe, I find very attractive. It's like not great.
That's so dysfunctional. But I can totally relate. I mean, so what do you go for then? What is it about the addict that you find attractive? The unsafe, okay, but what's the good? Like, how can you describe the good things about them?
It's not actually like the addiction, it's the sort of character that goes with it.
Totally. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Perhaps, I mean, it's damaged.
Right, because that's something that that you're seeking to fix.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably it's like, there's that, then there's and less so now, but when I first acknowledged this pattern, it was also to do with, well, don't look at me. I don't have to take ownership over my own issues with addiction.
Interesting.
Yeah, because it's like, well, look at them.
Yes.
You know?
That's interesting.
So I think there was that. But again, like, I've really, like...
You're working through it.
Yeah, and that's not really so much of a thing because I was so self-aware of it. And I could, like, again, that feeling of, like, this is coming from a really bad place. And I, you know, speed this up over the next couple of years. Like, this could get really ugly. And so I just was like, cut that out from my life until I can reprogram myself.
Right.
But with, I guess, what's attractive about... I don't know, it's something to do with feeling unsafe.
That's interesting. So I feel like for me, because I have a similar pattern, I've definitely had most of my boyfriends recently especially, but like, yeah, they've all been, not all, I can't say that, but many of them. And the ones that I've fallen really deep for have been addicts.
Really?
And they probably wouldn't appreciate me saying that about them because I don't think that they're addicts that have made the decision that they are. But I think also I like the way Russell Brand kind of explains it in his book. I think it's called Recovery. But he talks about the fact that most of us are sort of on a spectrum of addiction.
100%.
And so, like, if you're a substance addict, it's dangerous because obviously there's damaging physical effects that can occur in the short term, but with, you know, things like love, it's like a human need. So we can't, you know, if you're a love addict or a sex addict, those are things that humans still need to be able to survive. So it can be quite complex to try and navigate that.
And there's almost more shame wrapped around that.
There's more shame, totally. And then social media, shopping, gambling, like there's food, there's all kinds of things that we can fall into and not realize that there is a level of addiction there. Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately at the core of addiction, it's purely just distraction from trauma, something that we're trying to ignore. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the bond for me in finding addicts attractive. I think you hit the nail on the head for me, especially with my first interpretation of you saying, don't look at me, was actually because I thought, yes, actually it's both an excuse for me to not have to check my own shit because I'm so busy handling their trauma that I don't need to acknowledge my own. And the other thing is that I feel like when they're so deeply lost in their own pain, they won't see me. And what I mean by that is like, because to truly be seen is to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And it's this common theme for me is avoiding this vulnerability. And so if someone is locked in their trauma or their pain through addiction, through whatever they're avoiding, I can just join their journey and they won't have the ability to turn and look at me and take care of me properly. So that's this interesting...
Which I think a lot of women do, and it's this sort of caretaker thing where it's like, the more troubled a man is, the more like, let me save you.
Yeah, because it's like I have shame around my needs. And so I feel like if someone else can't serve my needs, that I can ignore them and escape it. And
you know what's really, that's just reminded me of my situation last year when I had a relationship end and it was like very traumatic, but I dealt with it at the offset very, very well. And then after a couple of months, I started thinking like, I want this, I think I want it back. And I went and met up with the person. And I mean, clearly, like my body's response was like, he is not in any place to be able to give you anything. And like dealing with serious, you know, trauma stuff. But I wanted to dive into that. This is like really fucking personal for me. It's making me feel a bit sick. But it was like, I journaled about it after and it was like, I want to dive into that person's like void almost to fill it, to make myself feel like I belong. Yes. So that's my thing of it rather than, but again, it's the same thing of not having my needs met.
Yeah.
And it's just like being absorbed by them. But actually he turned around to me and was like, no. And the sadness that I experienced or like whatever happened to me after was almost worse than the initial breakup because I was out of control. I couldn't control the situation at all. And I wasn't able to do that thing that I would have always done in the past. He was and he did me the biggest favor by doing that.
Yeah.
Because I would have dived straight into that shit show because it makes me feel like I belong, like I have a purpose.
Yeah.
in someone else's shit.
In someone else's shit. It's crazy. And it means you have an excuse to not face your own, basically.
Yeah.
It is essentially that, because it's painful to face our own pain.
Yeah, it's so much easier.
Yeah. Completely.
Then look at you look at someone else and you're like, oh, you've got some serious shit to deal with. Why don't I just help you with that and just leave my tools in the shed?
Totally.
And then what it brought me back to is having to like deal with my own stuff.
And then you have to deal with your own, and it's almost worse because you've been ignoring it for so long. It's like when you leave a sandwich in your locker at lunch. I know it's like probably a terrible analogy, but you just like leave it in there the whole school term, and then the next term, and then the next term. You just kind of like, I really should get to that, but it's so moldy and disgusting and awful that the longer you leave it, the harder it gets to actually put your hands on it and take it out. Whereas had you just dealt with it initially. But yes, that was an odd analogy to come up.
I like it.
But I think if you're one of those people that whether you're in a relationship and you're finding that you want to leave it, or the other side, you're single and you're resisting relationships, I think that a really good way to gauge, I mean, obviously I always recommend that people go and see psychologists, like absolutely, or a psychotherapist. But I think the gauge is kind of like, journal on the things that you're resisting. Like, what's the thing that brings up the most discomfort? It's like usually in there. That's what I always find. It's that thing when my psychologist initially brought up this idea of not having sex too quickly. She didn't say go celibate. What she's actually said to me was, if you meet someone that you have an interest in, you have chemistry with, I want you to wait 6 weeks before sleeping with him. And when I say that now, I don't flinch. It's like, yeah, cool, probably wait 8, maybe even longer. But actually, when she first said it, I cannot tell you how uncomfortable I was. And I literally I laughed. I was like, you're fucking kidding me, joking. Like, what the fuck? Of course I'm going to have sex with him immediately. That's how I'm going to know. And that was my gauge, was this like sexual thing. But it was
not was the best gauge.
No, I don't think it's ever, I genuinely don't think it's ever the best gauge. But interestingly enough, the only thing I will say is a good gauge. Oh God, this is such an overshare. But my vagina always knows. We talked about this before, but she always knows.
I don't know if I trust mine.
Do you not?
No, I'm joking.
Well, so what I mean is, my sexual energy doesn't always know, because my sexual energy can definitely lead me astray, but my vagina will always do something in the relationship or in this experience with someone else that is rejecting them when it's not supposed to be.
Like what?
On a chronic level. So basically, I knew that this relationship that I was in was over. Like, I just knew, and I was really becoming a shell of a woman because I was constantly putting up with pretty not ideal treatment, constant gaslighting of my needs, constant like things where he didn't even have time to have a like phone conversation with me or anything. And it was just getting to that point where if I expressed any need, it was like he would express back how much of a burden that was.
Oh, wow.
But interestingly, I had started to get thrush really badly, and I hadn't had thrush in my life before. And it can be common that like you kind of share it with your partner sometimes, like, but anyway, I basically was like, this is like a chronic level. I was like constantly having to take Canesten, and I was like, I don't understand why I keep getting this. Nothing's changed in my diet. I don't understand. We broke up. I stopped having sex with him.
Well,
no thrush. Yeah.
That's
no
mental.
Problem. I had sex with someone else after we'd broken up, and this is like way later, and no thrush. And the sex that I'd had with this guy was way more, we knew each other, we were like comfortable, it was a much more safe place for my vagina, and there was no reaction. Now, science will be able to will say something along the lines of, he might have been carrying the bacteria that caused some kind of reaction and changed
But we'll ignore that.
Well, but I just had experiences in so many relationships over the time where like this has come up and sometimes it hasn't. And it's always been in the relationship that's very, very unhealthy.
Well, it's like what I said about the thing
about
before.
your pain, your period pain. Totally. There are messages and warning signs that we get from our body that science cannot always explain. That doesn't mean it's not valid.
Would you say then from before... So going back to our like overarching theme, before your Saturn return, was your relationship to relationships like vastly different?
I it's hard to say because the level of awareness I had then versus now, it's very difficult to remember a lot of those relationships and the red flags I probably ignored in those. And I've been in long relationships as well. Like, it's only recently that relationships have been very short, but actually in my earlier days, like, I've been in relationships since I was 16. And so my first one was 4 years. My second one was 7 years. Then I had another 4-year one. Then I had a 3-year one. Then they've kind of become progressively shorter. And I think
Do you think they become a bit more... I sort of have a theory that at that time, at that transition, like, things just speed up and the lessons get like more like quick fire.
Totally.
Rather than being this kind of like slightly more fluid, feeling your way around, like having more time to play with.
Yeah, it's totally a time thing. I think also if we take it to like financial theories, we can talk about like the sunk loss fallacy, where in finance it'd be like continuously investing in a company that you know is failing. And I think that I probably was definitely doing that in relationships that were failing, but I was just so fucking codependent. And so I was very, very good at being in relationships that weren't actually meeting my needs because I just was really a shell. So I stayed in those relationships for longer. Now, to take another financial theory, which is failing fast. So good financial practices in companies are to fail fast. So you kind of go balls to wall with a company, and if you know it's failing, then you get out and acknowledge its failure fast.
Those are really good things to apply actually to relationships, because I think people, if they've been hurt especially, and I worry a little bit at the moment whether I'm going to be closed off from new experiences.
I think you're going to be cautious.
Yeah, which isn't a bad thing.
And I don't think that's a bad thing. And yeah, my manager, who's like one of my best friends, she turned to me and said, I think you're going to be more careful with your heart this time.
Yeah, which is really important actually, because I think we both obviously have been quite reckless with ours.
And our vaginas. So that sounds dodgy, but I think we've been reckless with who we've allowed. Like, this is what we were saying before. We wear our vagina on our sleeve.
No. I said
heart on our vagina.
Yeah, I was like, I used to always say this. My heart was in my vagina, because I'd say it's a bad idea to sleep with exes because my heart is in my vagina.
Yes, and then I stupidly said my vagina's on my sleeve, which just makes me sound really thirsty. It's not the right saying.
It doesn't make either of us sound great.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It's going to help my case in celibacy though, isn't it?
So how are you going to shift from, this? And have you given it a time, or?
I kind of thought maybe a year, but I don't know, because I also thought if I meet someone that I have a really strong connection to, am I going to want to sleep with them? Yeah, obviously I will if I like them. But I think one of the things that my therapist said to me actually was, Shona, if they're worthy of your love and your sex, then he will wait.
And this is, again, about someone choosing you. Like, when you meet someone and you're into them, they have to show up. And the scariest part of that is risking that they won't and staying in your worth. And your worth grows from that process. So if you have low self-worth, things will keep coming up. Like, a guy will keep coming up that's basically rejecting you, and you're then rejecting yourself. So the way that you grow your self-worth, I believe, is by when those experiences happen and you step into it with vulnerability and you say your needs and everything like that. And when they don't meet it, like at the beginning, before it goes too far, I guess I use the word retreat, but back into yourself.
Yes.
And it feels so uncomfortable, because I think we think, when we're saying like self-worth and all these like empowering things, like they don't feel that good when you're growing them. Actually, they feel hugely uncomfortable. But you go back into that place, you acknowledge, like, there is a rejection to acknowledge, but it's not of self.
Exactly. And I think self-love and self-respect are really interesting concepts and things that, you can talk about it. You can run yourself a bubble bath and light a candle, but,
that's
it's not really what it is. It's like choosing yourself. Choosing to honor your boundaries, or it can be as simple as like actionable things that are so some of the things that I realized that I was doing, particularly when we broke up, was that I was sort of like, I'd have late nights where I'd be like scrolling through Instagram and I'd be sort of like stalking him. Like, I think stalking your ex, particularly if you still have feelings for them and they've rejected you, or you feel like they've rejected you, is a form of self-harm.
100,000,000%.
Yeah. And I think masturbation for me felt like a means to procrastinate. And I also think procrastination is a form of self-harm as well. Because essentially it's like whenever I procrastinate in whatever I'm doing, it's really because I'm avoiding self-care, doing something that I know will enable me to live life in a better way for me. Even paying a bill is a form of self-love because it's going to enable your life to be better. And relationships, if you are somewhat addicted to negative ones, can be a form of self-harm in which you are choosing to procrastinate from yourself and like taking care of yourself via that other person and their problems. And
how do you think people can become more aware of that?
I think step one, if you can afford it, therapy is a really good place because you have trained professionals who are capable of unpacking this stuff with you. So for anyone listening that can afford it, what I will say about affording therapy is like, particularly if you are a drinker, if you were to take the money or work out the money that you spent the last month on alcohol and you were to add that all up and then look at that balance, the following month, you could maybe say, okay, for this next month, I'm going to take that amount and I'm going to put it into therapy. And just see what happens. Book it, right? It's like 1 month out of your life. If you hate it, you can stop. But I guarantee what's probably going to happen is you're going to go, shit, I actually need this.
Yeah.
And
I should have been here a few years ago.
And I should have been exactly. So I would say that's step one. I think step two is, there's a few people I think you can follow on Instagram that post things that can cause you to think about this kind of stuff. I think Mark Groves, we both follow on Instagram, he's Create the Love, and he posts incredible videos. He has a breakup program. So another person that I would definitely recommend following and also listening to is Brené Brown. She has a really quick talk on, I think it's Oprah's Super Soul Sundays, where she delivers a talk on the research that she's done on trust. It's called The Anatomy of Trust. And she just says some extremely powerful things about trust in relationships, like friendships too, not even just romantic partnerships, but just like, you know, are your friends showing up for you? And what does that mean? And also saying, if you don't show up for yourself, it's very difficult to expect other people to show up for you. And if you want to read some great books on relationship theories, I would highly recommend reading a book called Attached, which is on attachment theory. It's a very, very digestible and accessible book on complex theory, psychological theory around how we develop relationships and how we develop attachments, about insecure attachments and secure attachments. And it's just really worth a listen, and you will feel probably put at ease if you sit in any of those two categories, if you're really honest. You know,
that sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's a really great book.
Well, anyway, I think
we're done.
I think we're done. I think we've covered
so much
stuff. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Shona. One thing that I really took away from it, and it's been such a big part of my experience over the last couple of years, is taking responsibility within a relationship. I believe that relationships come into your life when they're supposed to, at the right time, to uncover something about yourself. And I don't ever view a relationship as a failure. I used to, and I used to have this sort of victim mentality within it, but I don't anymore. And I value every experience, and I've grown as a person through each relationship. And I think that really connects back to what Flo said at the start, like discovering our authenticity and taking responsibility isn't something that's easy. And I think when we start to embody this work and learn about it and really cultivate it into our life, opportunities will arise that challenge that. And I think it's just about having the mindset to approach it and be like, I can handle this. So if you want to hear more from Shona, you can find her on Instagram at Shona_Vertue. Virtue is spelled Vertue. And you can find me on Instagram at Caggie's World. Saturn Returned is a Feast Collective production. The producer is Hannah Barrell and the executive producer is Kate Taylor. It was mixed by Gabriella Jones. If you did enjoy this podcast, I'd love it if you could share it with someone you think might find it useful. So until next time, thank you so much for listening, and remember, you are not alone. Goodbye.